September 20th, 1946, 4:47 p.m. Henry Wallace sat alone in his Commerce Department office on Constitution Avenue. The afternoon light cut through Venetian blinds, casting prison bar shadows across his desk. He was staring at the telephone. It had rung 3 minutes ago. Harry Truman's voice had been polite, almost apologetic. But the words were final. "Henry, I'm accepting your resignation." Wallace hadn't offered to resign. The conversation replayed in his head. Truman's flat Missouri accent, the carefully chosen phrases, the diplomatic language that couldn't hide what this actually was. Wallace had been fired. 4 years ago, he had been Vice President of the United States. He had sat across from Franklin Roosevelt in cabinet meetings while they planned the invasion of Europe. He had traveled to China, the Soviet Union, Latin America, as FDR's personal envoy. He had been one heartbeat away from the presidency. Now he was unemployed, fired by a man he considered a historical accident, who never should have occupied the Oval Office in the first place. Wallace reached for the phone. His hand shook slightly, not from fear, from rage. He dialed his closest advisor. When the man answered, Wallace spoke 4 words that would change American history. "I'm going to destroy him." What followed was one of the most systematic campaigns to destroy a sitting president from within his own party. Wallace would deliver speeches in every major city attacking Truman's policies. He would write articles accusing Truman of warmongering. He would eventually run against Truman as a third-party candidate in 1948, and he would come closer to succeeding than anyone realized. But to understand why Henry Wallace spent 2 years trying to destroy Harry Truman, you need to understand what happened at the Democratic Convention in Chicago in July 1944, because that's where Wallace's presidency was stolen from him. And that's where his 2-year campaign for revenge began. Henry Wallace believed he was the rightful heir to Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. This wasn't paranoia. It was based on 4 years of reality. In 1940, Roosevelt had chosen Wallace as his running mate over the furious objections of Democratic Party bosses. The establishment thought Wallace was too liberal, too idealistic, too sympathetic to labor unions and civil rights. They wanted someone safe, someone controllable. Roosevelt didn't care what they wanted. He told the Democratic Convention he wanted Wallace, or he wouldn't run for a 3rd term. It was an ultimatum. The party bosses backed down. For the next 4 years, Wallace became one of the most active vice presidents in American history. Roosevelt sent him on diplomatic missions to Latin America, where Wallace promoted the good neighbor policy. He traveled to China, meeting with Chiang Kai-shek to coordinate the war against Japan. He visited the Soviet Union in 1944, touring Siberian factories and agricultural projects. Wallace chaired the Board of Economic Warfare, managing billions of dollars in military contracts. He gave speeches explaining Roosevelt's vision for the post-war world, a world without colonial empires, without poverty, without the conditions that had created fascism. He became the public face of Roosevelt's domestic and foreign policy. By 1944, Wallace genuinely believed he was Roosevelt's chosen successor. He had earned it through 4 years of loyal service, through thousands of speeches, through diplomatic victories in Latin America and China. More importantly, Roosevelt himself had told Wallace he wanted him to continue as vice president. In private conversations at the White House, Roosevelt praised Wallace's idealism, his commitment to social justice, his vision for post-war America. Wallace went into the 1944 Democratic Convention believing he had Roosevelt's full support. He was wrong. July 11th, 1944, 10 p.m., the White House. Democratic National Committee Chairman Robert Hannegan sat across from President Roosevelt with a single piece of paper. It was a list of names. Every name on that list belonged to someone who wanted Henry Wallace gone. There were Southern governors who hated Wallace's support for civil rights, labor leaders who thought he was too radical, big city bosses who considered him politically naive, conservative Democrats who feared his economic views. But what unified them all was one terrifying reality. Roosevelt was dying. Everyone in that room knew it. Roosevelt's hands trembled when he signed documents. His face was gaunt. He could barely work more than 4 hours a day. The man who had led America through the Depression and World War II was exhausted in a way that no amount of rest could fix. The 1944 vice presidential nomination wasn't about choosing a running mate. It was about choosing the next president of the United States. And the Democratic Party establishment had decided that man could not be Henry Wallace. Hannigan delivered the ultimatum without softening it. Mr. President, if Wallace remains on the ticket, there will be open revolt at the convention. Southern delegates will walk out. Fundraising will collapse. You might win the nomination, but you'll lose the general election. Roosevelt sat in silence. He knew Hannigan was right. He also knew what this meant for Wallace. But Roosevelt was a practical politician. His legacy depended on Democrats staying in power. If forcing Wallace onto the ticket meant losing to Republicans, everything he had built with the New Deal would be dismantled. Roosevelt agreed to replace Wallace, but he left the choice of replacement deliberately vague. The party bosses had their victory. Now, they needed to execute the plan. They chose Harry Truman. Truman was a senator from Missouri. He wasn't particularly liberal or conservative. He wasn't exciting or controversial. He was safe, boring, and acceptable to all factions of the party. Most importantly, nobody hated him. July 20th, 1944, Chicago Stadium. Wallace didn't give up without a fight. He had delegates. He had passionate supporters who believed in Roosevelt's liberal vision. On the convention floor, Wallace forces tried to force a first ballot vote before the bosses could organize against him. If they could get Wallace nominated before deals were made in smoke-filled rooms, they could win. The stadium was packed. 20,000 people chanting, "We want Wallace! We want Wallace!" The noise was deafening. Chicago Mayor Ed Kelly saw what was happening. If the vote happened now, Wallace might win. The bosses hadn't finished organizing. They needed time. Kelly rushed to the podium and grabbed the microphone. He claimed there was a fire hazard due to overcrowding in the stadium. He forced an immediate adjournment, just as the pro-Wallace chant was reaching its peak. It was one of the most brazen manipulations in American political history, and it worked. When delegates returned the next day, the bosses had marshaled enough support to give the nomination to Truman on the second ballot. Henry Wallace's career as a national political figure was finished. The full extent of Roosevelt's betrayal wasn't revealed until after his death. Roosevelt had written multiple letters about the vice presidency, playing all sides. He wrote a public letter supporting Wallace, saying he would personally vote for him if he were a delegate. But he also wrote a private note to party bosses, saying he would be happy with either Harry Truman or William Douglas. The public letter gave Wallace false hope. The private note gave the bosses permission to destroy him. Roosevelt had offered Wallace polite words with one hand, while signing his political death warrant with the other. For a man who prided himself on loyalty, who had served Roosevelt faithfully for 4 years, who had believed in FDR's vision of a better world, this was the ultimate betrayal. Wallace accepted Roosevelt's offer to become Secretary of Commerce in November 1944. It was a consolation prize, a significant demotion that everyone recognized as such. But Wallace still believed in Roosevelt's vision. He thought he could influence policy from inside the administration. Then, on April 12, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt died. Harry Truman became president, and Henry Wallace found himself serving under the man who had replaced him. The cabinet meetings were excruciating. Wallace sat there, watching the man who should have been his subordinate struggle with the weight of the office. Every time Truman made a decision, Wallace measured it against what Roosevelt would have done. To Wallace, Truman wasn't just unqualified. He was fundamentally the wrong man for the moment. Wallace had spent years at Roosevelt's right hand, shaping global policy, thinking about the post-war world. Truman was a former haberdasher from Missouri, a failed hat shop owner, and a product of the corrupt Pendergast political machine. Wallace had been Roosevelt's trusted advisor for 4 years. Truman had met with Roosevelt exactly twice during his 3 months as vice president. Roosevelt hadn't even told Truman about the Manhattan Project until after he became president. Yet Truman was president, and Wallace was Commerce Secretary. The resentment wasn't just political, it was visceral. The breaking point came over Joseph Stalin. Wallace believed Stalin could be trusted if America showed good faith. Truman believed Stalin was a dictator, systematically expanding Soviet control over Eastern Europe. Wallace's view came from his 1944 trip to the Soviet Union. He had toured Magadan and the Kolyma gold mines in Siberia. These were actually part of the Gulag system, death camps where hundreds of thousands of prisoners had frozen, starved, or been worked to death. But NKVD handlers had disguised them as volunteer labor camps. They showed Wallace well-fed workers, modern facilities, cultural programs. Wallace famously described the camp director, a man responsible for mass murder, as a sensitive man. He came away convinced that cooperation with Stalin was possible, that the Soviet Union was building a society without class distinctions, that Stalin would allow democratic governance in Eastern Europe if America just showed trust. Truman's view came from watching Stalin break every single agreement made at Yalta. The rigged elections in Poland, the communist coup in Romania, the systematic looting of East Germany, the kidnapping of non-communist political leaders in Hungary and Bulgaria. While Wallace saw a partner, Truman saw a predator. By early 1946, Truman had adopted a policy that would become known as containment. America would resist Soviet expansion through economic aid, military alliances, and strategic firmness, but it would avoid direct military confrontation. George Kennan's long telegram from Moscow had explained the Soviet mindset. Stalin only respected strength. He interpreted American attempts at friendship as weakness to be exploited. Wallace thought this was catastrophically wrong. He had seen Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He was terrified of atomic war. Wallace believed Truman's tough stance would provoke Stalin into aggression. He argued that if America just showed trust and cooperation, Stalin would reciprocate. Wallace made these arguments in private cabinet meetings. Truman listened politely and ignored him. Wallace wrote memos. Truman filed them away. Wallace requested private meetings with the president. Truman was always too busy. By September 1946, Wallace was desperate. The country was moving toward confrontation with the Soviets. Wallace believed World War III was becoming inevitable unless someone stopped Truman's policy. He decided to go public. September 12, 1946. Henry Wallace stood before 20,000 people packed into Madison Square Garden in New York City. He was there to give a speech about foreign policy. He had cleared the speech with Truman's staff, or so he claimed. What Wallace told that crowd contradicted everything Truman's Secretary of State was saying in Europe at that exact moment. While James Burns was in Paris negotiating with the Soviets from a position of strength, Wallace was in New York, arguing America needed to show trust and cooperation. Wallace told the crowd that Truman's policy of firmness was pushing the world toward war. He said America's atomic weapons were making the Soviets paranoid. He argued that Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe was defensive, not aggressive. He claimed Stalin would allow free elections if America stopped being confrontational. The crowd loved it. These were liberals who wanted to believe Roosevelt's vision of post-war cooperation with the Soviets was still possible. They were terrified of another war. Wallace was telling them what they wanted to hear. The press reaction was immediate and explosive. Reporters pointed out that Wallace had directly contradicted American foreign policy while serving in Truman's cabinet. Foreign policy experts noted that Wallace's speech would be seen in Moscow as a sign of American division and weakness. James Burns was furious. He cabled Truman from Paris, demanding to know if Wallace's speech represented administration policy. If it did, Burns would resign. If it didn't, Wallace needed to be silenced. Truman was in a political trap. When reporters asked if he had approved Wallace's speech, Truman, who hadn't actually read it carefully, told them he approved the whole speech. It was a catastrophic mistake. For a week, Truman tried to manage the crisis. He issued statements saying Wallace's views were his personal opinion, not administration policy. This satisfied no one. How could a cabinet member have a personal opinion that contradicted the president's foreign policy? Wallace refused to back down. He gave interviews defending his speech. He said the American people deserved a debate about foreign policy. He implied that Truman's advisors were warmongers. Then Wallace made his fatal error. He invoked Roosevelt's name. He suggested that Roosevelt would have agreed with his position, not Truman's. This was unforgivable. Wallace wasn't just disagreeing with policy. He was using Roosevelt's ghost to undermine Truman's authority. He was suggesting that Truman had betrayed Roosevelt's legacy. September 20th, 1946. Truman called Wallace to the White House. The conversation was brief. Truman told Wallace he needed a cabinet that spoke with one voice on foreign policy. Wallace could either stop making public statements contradicting administration policy or resign. Wallace chose to fight. He told Truman he had a constitutional right to free speech. He said the American people needed to hear alternative views on foreign policy. He argued that Truman was betraying Roosevelt's vision of cooperation with the Soviets. Truman ended the meeting. He returned to his office and dictated a letter accepting Wallace's resignation. Wallace hadn't offered to resign. Truman was firing him. The letter was delivered to Wallace's office that afternoon. Wallace was stunned. He had expected Truman to back down. He thought Truman needed him to maintain support from Roosevelt liberals. He believed his political base gave him leverage. Wallace had miscalculated completely. Truman was willing to lose Wallace's supporters rather than tolerate a cabinet member who publicly contradicted foreign policy. Party unity mattered less than policy coherence. That's when Wallace realized something. He was free. Free from cabinet discipline. Free from administration loyalty. Free to say exactly what he thought about Truman's policies. Free to destroy Truman's presidency. Wallace called a press conference for the next day. Instead of issuing a gracious statement about moving on, Wallace announced he was dedicating himself to changing American foreign policy. He said Truman was leading America toward permanent confrontation with the Soviet Union. He said Truman had betrayed Roosevelt's legacy. Political analysts said Wallace had destroyed his political career. Wallace didn't care. He believed stopping Truman's foreign policy was more important than his own political future. From October 1946 through 1948, Wallace delivered hundreds of speeches to packed venues across America. He wrote articles for the New Republic attacking Truman's policies. He organized a political movement opposing containment. The media coverage was massive. Wallace's criticisms of Truman reached millions of Americans. He became the most prominent voice opposing containment. Truman's advisors were genuinely worried. The content of Wallace's speeches grew more extreme over time. In early 1947, he began arguing that Truman's policy was actually causing Soviet aggression. He claimed that if America would just disarm and show good faith, Stalin would reciprocate. He suggested the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe was America's fault for being confrontational. These arguments horrified foreign policy experts. They pointed out that Stalin had broken agreements made at Yalta before Truman had even adopted a tough stance. Soviet expansion was happening, regardless of American policy. Wallace was blaming the victim. But Wallace's supporters didn't care about expert analysis. They cared about avoiding war. And Wallace was the only prominent political figure telling them war could be avoided. In early 1947, American intelligence agencies noticed something disturbing. Soviet propaganda was quoting Henry Wallace extensively. Radio Moscow broadcast his speeches. Soviet newspapers reprinted his articles. Wallace's criticisms of Truman were being used to undermine American foreign policy. Wallace didn't see this as a problem. He argued that Soviet media quoted him because he was telling the truth. If Stalin's government found his message useful, that was because his message was correct. But the intelligence community saw something more troubling. Wallace was receiving assistance from organizations with Soviet connections. The groups organizing his speaking tours had ties to communist parties. His staff included people who had worked with Soviet front organizations. Wallace might have been sincere in his beliefs, but he was being used by Moscow. In December 1947, Henry Wallace announced he was running for president. He would lead a new progressive party dedicated to peace and cooperation with the Soviet Union. The announcement shocked the political establishment. Wallace knew he couldn't win. Third-party candidates never won presidential elections. But he believed he could force Truman to change course on foreign policy. If Wallace drew enough votes away from Truman, the president would have to moderate his stance on the Soviets to win re-election. The Progressive Party platform called for immediate negotiations with Stalin, withdrawal of American troops from Europe, sharing atomic weapons technology with the United Nations, including the Soviet Union, dismantling American military bases abroad, ending economic assistance tied to anti-communist conditions. It was everything Moscow wanted. Soviet media celebrated Wallace's candidacy. Communist parties in Europe endorsed him. Wallace accepted their support, arguing that anyone who wanted peace should be welcome in his coalition. This was politically catastrophic. Wallace's association with communists allowed Truman to paint him as a Soviet dupe, or worse. Wallace campaigned across America in early 1948. His rallies drew thousands. His message of peace resonated with voters tired of international tensions. Polls showed him drawing 10 to 15% of the vote. almost entirely from Democrats who would otherwise support Truman. Democratic Party leaders panicked. If Wallace pulled that many votes, Truman would lose to Republican Thomas Dewey. The White House would flip to Republican control. Democrats would lose Congress. Everything Roosevelt had built would be dismantled. Truman's political advisors begged him to moderate his foreign policy to win back Wallace supporters. Truman refused. He wasn't going to change American strategic policy to win an election. The Soviets were expanding. Containment was necessary. Wallace's supporters would have to choose between idealism and reality. By summer 1948, every political analyst was predicting Truman's defeat. The Democratic Party was fracturing. Wallace was pulling liberal votes. Southern Democrats had bolted over civil rights to form the Dixiecrat Party. Thomas Dewey was running a strong Republican campaign. Every poll showed Truman losing. Newsweek surveyed 50 top political writers. All 50 predicted Dewey would win. The Chicago Daily Tribune prepared a victory headline for Dewey before the votes were even counted. Truman's presidency appeared finished. Wallace didn't need to win. He just needed to make Truman lose. By siphoning liberal votes in New York, Michigan, and Maryland, he was handing key states to the Republicans. Then something changed in the final months of the campaign. Events in Europe vindicated Truman's policy and exposed Wallace's naivete. In February 1948, communists staged a coup in Czechoslovakia, overthrowing the democratic government. The coup was clearly coordinated with Moscow. Soviet agents had infiltrated the Czech security services. When non-communist ministers tried to resist, they were arrested. Some were thrown from windows. Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk, the son of Czechoslovakia's founding president, was found dead beneath his bathroom window. The Soviets claimed suicide. Everyone knew it was murder. Then, in June 1948, the Soviet Union blocked all ground access to West Berlin. 2 million people in the western sectors faced starvation. Truman responded with the Berlin airlift, flying in food, coal, and supplies around the clock. These events demonstrated exactly what Truman had been warning about. Stalin wasn't interested in cooperation or free elections. Soviet expansion was real and aggressive. Wallace's arguments about Stalin's defensive intentions suddenly looked absurd. American voters shifted. Wallace's poll numbers dropped from 10 to 15%, down to 5%. Liberals who had been tempted by his peace message decided containment was necessary. War-weary Americans realized that cooperation with Stalin wasn't possible. On election day, Wallace received only 2.4% of the national vote. He won 0 electoral votes. His campaign succeeded only in demonstrating how wrong he had been about Soviet intentions. Truman won re-election in one of the greatest upsets in American political history. The famous Chicago Tribune headline, "Dewey defeats Truman," became a symbol of how completely the experts had misread the race. Wallace's 2-year campaign to destroy Truman's presidency had failed completely. Worse, it had discredited the very position he was advocating. His association with Soviet propaganda had made opposition to containment politically toxic for a generation. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces invaded South Korea with Soviet weapons and Stalin's approval. The attack was unprovoked and clearly coordinated with Moscow. It proved everything Truman had argued about Soviet intentions. If America had followed Wallace's advice and withdrawn from Asia, South Korea would have fallen in weeks. If America had shared atomic weapons technology with the United Nations, as Wallace proposed, the Soviets would have had nuclear weapons years earlier. If America had dismantled its military, as Wallace recommended, the entire Korean peninsula would be communist. The Korean War destroyed what remained of Wallace's credibility. Wallace issued a statement supporting Truman's decision to defend South Korea. It was a quiet admission that he had been wrong about everything. Stalin couldn't be trusted. Soviet expansion was aggressive, not defensive. Military strength and alliances were necessary. By 1952, Wallace had retreated from public life. He wrote occasional articles but never again challenged American foreign policy. He had spent 2 years trying to destroy Truman's presidency and ended up destroying his own legacy instead. In 1952, Henry Wallace published an article in This Week magazine titled, "Where I Was Wrong." It was the closest he ever came to a full apology. He admitted he had been naive about Soviet intentions. He acknowledged that some organizations supporting his 1948 campaign had been controlled by communists. He conceded that containment had been necessary, but Wallace never admitted the fundamental mistake. He had been so convinced Truman was wrong that he spent 2 years trying to destroy a president who was actually right. He had given speeches that Soviet propaganda used to undermine American policy. He had run a campaign that nearly cost Truman re-election at a critical moment in the Cold War. He died in 1965, largely forgotten by American politics. Former supporters had quietly distanced themselves. Liberal intellectuals who once cheered his speeches admitted they had been wrong. His name became associated with naive appeasement. Obituaries noted his service as vice president and his achievements in agricultural science. Most glossed over his 2-year campaign against Truman. Henry Wallace spent 2 years trying to destroy Harry Truman's presidency because he believed Truman was wrong about the Soviet Union. History proved Wallace was the one who was wrong. His tragedy wasn't a lack of patriotism. It was a surplus of hope. He looked at Stalin and saw a partner, because the alternative, that the man he wanted to believe in was a ruthless dictator, was too terrifying to accept. In the end, conviction proved no substitute for judgment, and being Roosevelt's vice president didn't make someone qualified to be Roosevelt's successor.